There's a moment that almost feels unreal, like something inside your life quietly flipped without asking for permission. And suddenly, the person who once felt distant, cold, and impossible to reach begins to move toward you in ways they never did before. You sit there thinking, where was this energy when I was giving everything? Where was this effort when I was the one trying to hold it all together? And the truth is, nothing about them randomly changed overnight. The real shift, the one that feels almost invisible but changes everything, happened inside you. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it doesn't come with a big announcement. It's subtle, almost silent, but somehow they feel it, they sense it. And that's when the dynamic starts to reverse. That's when they begin to chase. Not because you ask them to, but because the version of you they once knew is no longer there in the same way. And that realization hits them deeper than anything you ever said out loud. Most people misunderstand how this works. They think if they just explain themselves better, love harder, stay longer, or prove their loyalty enough times, things will finally shift. But that approach only leads to more confusion, more distance, and more emotional exhaustion. Because the truth about avoidant behavior is something most people never fully grasp. They don't respond to pressure, they don't respond to emotional intensity, and they definitely don't respond to someone chasing them. In fact, the more you lean in, the more they feel the need to lean out. It's not because they don't feel anything, it's because they feel too much and don't know how to process it safely. So instead of moving closer, they create space. Instead of reassurance, they give silence. And while you're trying to close the gap, they're trying to protect themselves from feeling overwhelmed. That's the part no one tells you. It was never about you not being enough. It was about the way the connection felt to them when it became too intense, too available, too certain. And when something feels too certain to someone who is wired to protect their independence, they start to lose attraction without even realizing why. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, without even noticing it at first, you slowly begin to lose yourself, not all at once, not in some obvious way, but in small, quiet sacrifices that added up over time. You started overthinking every message, every delay, every change in tone. You adjusted your behavior just to keep the peace. You gave more understanding than you were receiving. You made excuses for things that didn't sit right with you. And deep down, there was this constant feeling like you had to earn stability instead of simply experiencing it. You weren't being loved freely, you were trying to maintain something fragile. And the more you tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped through your fingers. Not because you weren't worthy, but because you were giving from a place of fear instead of a place of grounded confidence. You were pouring energy into someone who wasn't meeting you halfway, hoping that eventually they would see your value the way you saw theirs. But in doing that, you slowly disconnected from your own sense of self. You stopped asking what you needed and focused entirely on what would keep them around. And this is where it gets even more real, because chasing someone who operates this way doesn't just fail, it actually pushes them further away. Every time you reach out for clarity, every time you try to fix things, every time you express your emotions, hoping it will bring you closer, it creates the exact opposite effect. It makes them feel like they're losing control of their space. And when that happens, their instinct isn't to move towards you. It's to pull back, to create distance, to regain a sense of emotional safety. So while you're thinking, if I just show them how much I care, they'll understand, they're experiencing it as pressure, even if that was never your intention. That's why you can give your best, your most genuine effort, and still feel like it's not landing the way it should, because you're playing a game where the rules were never explained to you. And by the time you start to realize what's happening, you're already emotionally invested, already attached, already hoping that things will somehow turn around if you just try a little harder. But here's the part that changes everything. The version of you that kept trying, kept explaining, kept waiting, kept accepting less than you deserved. That version, no matter how kind, no matter how patient, no matter how loving, was not being respected in the way you needed. Not because you lacked value, but because your value became too accessible, too available, too predictable. And when someone knows that no matter what they do, you'll still be there, still understanding, still giving, they stop feeling the urgency to meet you at your level. They stop feeling the risk of losing you. And without that risk, without that sense of uncertainty, attraction begins to fade in a way that's hard to explain but easy to feel. You became someone they didn't have to work to keep, someone they didn't have to rise for. And even though your intentions were pure, even though your feelings were real, the dynamics shifted into something unbalanced, something where you were investing more than you were receiving, something where you were hoping for consistency instead of experiencing it naturally. And this is exactly why everything starts to change when a new version of you appears. Not the version that is trying to be better for them, but the version that finally starts to come back to yourself. The version that stops overextending, stops explaining, stops chasing clarity, stops waiting for someone else to decide your worth. That shift doesn't come from anger. It comes from awareness, from realizing that love was never supposed to feel like constant effort just to keep someone interested, from understanding that the more you abandon yourself, the less they feel drawn to you. And the moment you begin to pull your energy back, not as a strategy, not as a game, but as a genuine return to your own center, something unexpected begins to happen. The same person who once seemed distant starts to feel your absence, not just physically, but emotionally. And that absence, that quiet space where your energy used to be, becomes louder than anything you ever said. And that absence, that quiet space where your energy used to be, becomes louder than anything you ever said. Because now, for the first time, you're no longer pouring yourself into something that wasn't pouring back into you. You're no longer trying to fix what you didn't break. You're no longer holding on out of fear of losing them. And this is where the real turning point begins. Not when you force yourself to move on, not when you pretend you don't care, but when you genuinely stop needing them in the way you once did. It's subtle at first. You don't wake up one day completely detached. It happens in layers. You start checking your phone less. You stop analyzing every little detail. You begin to focus on your own life again, your own routine, your own peace. And slowly that emotional grip they had on you begins to loosen. Not because they changed, but because you did. And this is the part that feels almost strange. Because the more you stop centering your world around them, the more your energy beguile. NS, to feel calm, grounded, and self-contained. You're no longer reaching outward for validation. You're starting to generate it from within. And that shift, that internal stability, is something they can feel even if you never say a word about it. Because when you stop needing someone, your entire presence changes. You move differently, you speak differently, you respond differently. There's no longer this underlying urgency in your energy. No longer this quiet anxiety that used to sit beneath your words. You're not waiting anymore. You're not hoping anymore. You're simply existing in your own space without trying to pull them into it. And that's where your power begins to return to you. Not the kind of power that controls someone else, but the kind that centers you so deeply within yourself that you no longer feel shaken by their inconsistency. Emotional independence isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming whole on your own. It's about realizing that your peace doesn't depend on someone else's behavior. And once you reach that state, even slightly, even imperfectly, it creates a shift that they can't ignore. Because before, your energy was reaching toward them. Now it's rooted within you. And that difference, that grounded stillness, is something that draws attention in a way that chasing never could. And then comes the part that feels almost counterintuitive, the silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from playing games or trying to prove a point, but the kind that comes naturally when you no longer feel the need to fill every gap, to explain every feeling, to respond to every inconsistency. You stop sending long messages trying to make things make sense. You stop asking questions that were never being answered clearly. You stop reacting to every shift in your behavior. And in that silence, something powerful begins to unfold. Because now, instead of you constantly reaching out, they're left alone with their own thoughts, left alone with the absence of your presence. And that's when your value starts to become real to them in a way it never was before. Not when you were giving it freely, not when you're always available, but when it's no longer as accessible. Silence creates space. And in that space, people are forced to feel what they've been avoiding. They start to notice what's missing. They start to question what changed. And most importantly, they start to feel the weight of your absence. At the same time, something else begins to shift in the way they perceive you. You become unpredictable again. And this is important because when someone feels like they figured you out completely, when they know exactly how you'll react, exactly how you'll respond, exactly how much you'll tolerate, they stop feeling that sense of curiosity that initially drew them in. Predictability in this dynamic often leads to emotional distance. But now you're no longer reacting the same way. You're no longer responding instantly. You're no longer trying to maintain the connection at all costs. And that unpredictability, not forced but natural, creates intrigue. It creates a question in their mind that wasn't there before. What happened? Why does this feel different? Why are they not reacting the way they used to? And those questions begin to pull their attention back toward you, not because you asked for it, but because your energy no longer revolves around them. You've stepped out of the pattern they were comfortable with. And when that pattern breaks, it forces them to look at you in a new light. And this is where the mystery begins to take shape. Not because you're trying to be mysterious, but because you're no longer over-explaining yourself. You're no longer laying everything out in a way that leaves nothing to be. Discovered that equity, you're allowing space for things to be felt rather than constantly defined. And for someone who is used to emotional distance, that kind of subtlety becomes incredibly compelling because now they can't read you as easily. They can't predict your next move. They can't rely on the certainty they once had about your presence in their life. And that uncertainty, that not fully knowing, creates a pull that feels almost magnetic. They begin to wonder about you, to think about you, to replay past moments, trying to understand where the shift happened. And without realizing it, they start leaning in slowly, cautiously, but noticeably. Not because you convinced them to, not because you proved anything, but because the version of you they once took for granted is no longer standing in the same place, waiting to be chosen. Not because you convinced them to, not because you proved anything, but because the version of you they once took for granted is no longer standing in the same place, waiting to be chosen. And that's when something deeper begins to happen inside them, something they can't easily ignore or push away the way they did before. They start replaying you in their mind, not just the surface level memories, but the little things, the way you spoke, the way you understood them without them needing to explain everything, the way you created a kind of emotional safety they didn't fully appreciate at the time. And now, without your constant presence, those memories begin to feel louder, clearer, almost haunting in a quiet way. Because before, they didn't have to sit with those thoughts for long. You were always there, filling the space, keeping the connection alive. But now the silence you left behind forces reflection. It forces them to confront what they felt, what they ignored, and what they may have lost. And this is where the shift starts to feel real. Because now you're not the one thinking about them all the time. They're thinking about you. And the more they try to distract themselves, the more those thoughts find their way back in. Not aggressively, but persistently, like something unresolved that refuses to stay buried. At the same time, your value begins to change in their eyes. Not because you suddenly became more worthy, but because your presence is no longer guaranteed. You're not as accessible as you once were. You're not replying with the same urgency, not showing up with the same consistency, not offering the same emotional availability without it being reciprocated. And that shift creates something that wasn't there before, a sense of scarcity. And scarcity, when it comes to attention and emotional connection, has a powerful effect on perception. When something is always available, it's easy to overlook, easy to assume it will always be there. But when that same thing becomes limited, when it's no longer something they can reach whenever they want, it gains weight, it gains importance. And suddenly your time, your attention, your presence, all the things they once had easy access to start to feel valuable in a way they didn't before. Not because you changed who you are, but because you changed how much of yourself you give. You're no longer overextending. You're no longer giving without boundaries. And that difference, that controlled intentional energy, creates a new dynamic where they begin to feel the need to move toward you instead of away from you. And what makes this even more powerful is that your growth isn't just external. It's not just about how you look, what you post, or how you present yourself on the surface. It's internal. It's in the way you carry yourself, the way you respond, the way you no longer get pulled into emotional highs and lows based on someone else's inconsistency. There's a LMness to you now, a quiet confidence that doesn't need to be announced or validated. And that kind of energy is rare. It's not loud, it's not attention seeking, but it's deeply felt. Because when someone who once had access to your emotional world sees that you're no longer operating from the same place, it creates curiosity. It creates attraction. They start to notice that you're not reacting the way you used to, that you're not chasing, not over-explaining, not trying to fix things. And that subtle glow up, that internal shift towards self-respect, toward emotional balance, becomes more attractive than anything you could have done to impress them before. Because now you're not trying to be chosen. You already chose yourself. And that energy, that quiet self-assurance, is something they can't replicate and can't ignore. But here's where it gets even more complex. Because for someone who struggles with closeness, attraction doesn't always show up in the way you expect. They don't suddenly become emotionally open or consistent overnight. Instead, they begin to move closer in a way that still feels controlled, still feels safe from their perspective. Because avoidant tendencies don't disappear. They adapt. They want connection, but only when it doesn't feel overwhelming. They want closeness, but only when it doesn't feel like they're losing their independence. And this is why they often chase what feels slightly out of reach. Not completely gone, but not fully available either. That distance creates a sense of safety for them. It allows them to engage without feeling trapped. And now, because you're no longer overextending yourself, because you're no longer emotionally flooding the connection, it feels safer for them to come closer. Not because you made it easy, but because you stopped making it intense. You stopped creating a dynamic where they felt like they had to meet a level they weren't ready for. And in that space, that balanced distance, they begin to lean in slowly, carefully, but intentionally. And maybe the most powerful shift of all is the moment you stop seeking closure. The moment you stop needing answers to questions that were never clearly addressed. You stop asking why things happened the way they did. You stop trying to get them to explain their behavior, to define the connection, to give you the clarity you once felt you needed to move on because you realized something deeper. Closure was never something they could give you. It was something you had to create within yourself. It comes from understanding your own worth, your own boundaries, your own emotional needs, and recognizing where those things were not being met. And when you reach that point, even partially, it changes the entire dynamic because now you're not interacting from a place of confusion or need. You're interacting from a place of clarity and self-respect. You're no longer trying to fix the past. You've accepted, you've learned from it, and you've moved forward in a way that doesn't require their validation to feel complete. And that quiet sense of closure within yourself becomes the final shift that transforms everything. Because now, even if they come back, even if they reach out, even if they start showing interest again, you're no longer the same person who was waiting for that moment. Because now, even if they come back, even if they reach out, even if they start showing interest again, you're no longer the same person who was waiting for that moment. And this is where something hits them in a way they didn't expect. They begin to feel the loss, not in a dramatic, loud way, but in a slow, undeniable realization that something meaningful has shifted. It's not just about your absence physically. It's about the emotional space you use to fill in their life that now feels empty. The conversations that once came easily aren't there anymore. The sense of being understood without having to explain themselves, gone. The quiet comfort of knowing someone was there consistently, even when they didn't fully appreciate it, replaced with uncertainty. And that's when it truly lands for them. Not when you were explaining your feelings, not when you were trying to make things work, but when you stopped, when you stepped back without chaos, without drama, without trying to force anything. That kind of exit, calm, grounded, and complete, is what creates a loss they can actually feel. Because now they're not reacting to your words, they're reacting to your absence. And absence has a way of revealing value in a way presence sometimes never could. And eventually that feeling leads to something that once felt impossible. They reach out, but it doesn't always look the way you imagined it would. It's rarely some deep emotional confession or a perfectly worded apology that ties everything together. Instead, it's often subtle, a simple message, a casual check-in, something that almost feels small on the surface, but carries a deeper intention underneath. They might act like nothing has changed, like they're just reconnecting lightly. But beneath that, there's curiosity. There's an attempt to re-enter your space without fully exposing themselves. Because even now, they're still navigating their own internal patterns, still trying to protect themselves from feeling too much at once. And this moment, this quiet reappearance, is where everything you've learned gets tested. Because a part of you, the version of you that once waited, might feel the urge to respond the same way you used to open up quickly, to give them access again, to fall back into the familiarity of what once felt like connection. B. UT, this is where the real shift needs to hold. Not by ignoring them completely or playing games, but by staying grounded in who you've become. Because the biggest trap isn't them leaving. It's you going back to being the version of yourself that accepted less than you deserve. It's slipping back into overgiving, over-explaining, over-investing before they've shown consistency. It's abandoning your boundaries the moment they show a little bit of effort. And this is where most people lose everything they work so hard to rebuild within themselves. Because the pull of familiarity is strong, the emotional memory of what you once felt can make you forget why things didn't work in the first place. But growth means remembering. It means recognizing that just because someone comes back doesn't mean they've changed in the ways that matter. And it means understanding that your role is no longer to prove your value. It's to protect it, to observe, to see if their actions align with what you now know you deserve. And if they don't, to walk away without needing to explain why. That's the difference. That's the new standard you carry now. Not from a place of ego, but from a place of self-respect. Because the new version of you doesn't chase, you choose. You're no longer trying to be the one they finally decide to commit to. You're no longer shaping yourself into what you think they need. You're not waiting for clarity, not hoping for consistency, not holding on to potential. You're looking at what's real, what's being shown to you in the present moment. And from that place, you make decisions, calm, clear, and grounded decisions. You decide what you allow into your life. You decide what kind of energy you engage with. You decide who gets access to your time, your attention, your emotional world. And that shift from chasing to choosing is what changes everything. Because now our dynamic is no longer one-sided. You're not trying to win them over. You're seeing if they even align with the life you're building for yourself. And that perspective, that quiet confidence in your own work, creates a presence that doesn't need to demand respect. It naturally commands it. And in the end, when everything settles, when all the emotions, the confusion, the lessons, the growth finally come together, you realize something that changes the way you see the entire experience. It was never really about them. It was never about figuring them out, fixing the connection, or getting them to show up in the way you needed. It was about you, about the version of yourself you became in the process, the awareness you gained, the boundaries you learned to set, the way you started to value your own peace more than someone else's inconsistent presence. Because if they never pulled away, you might have never looked inward. If they had given you just enough to keep you comfortable, you might have stayed in a dynamic that slowly drained you. But instead, the distance, the confusion, the emotional highs and lows, they forced you to grow. They pushed you to a place where you had to choose yourself. Not because it was easy, but because it became necessary. And that's the final truth. The moment they start chasing isn't the victory. It's not the end goal. It's just a reflection of the shift that already happened within you. Because the real transformation was never about making someone come back. It was about becoming someone who no longer needs them to. Someone who can walk away without losing themselves. Someone who can receive love without chasing it. Someone who understands that real connection doesn't feel like confusion, doesn't feel like constant effort, doesn't feel like something you have to hold together on your own. And once you reach that place, even if they come back, even if they try again, you're no longer looking at them the same way because now you see clearly. And when you see clearly, you don't chase what you once chased. You choose what truly chooses.